I'm joined today by Tristram McPherson, philosopher over at the Ohio State University. If you want to maybe introduce yourself a little bit about things that you work on, that would probably be a great place to start.
Great. Yeah. So I work mostly on sort of abstract theoretical questions about ethics. I'm interested in thinking about the nature of our ethical thought, thinking about whether the idea of improving our ethical thought as a kind of thought makes sense, as well as in various kinds of sort of more prosaic ethical questions. One of the things I think we're going to talk about a bunch today are ethical questions having to do with our relationships to non-human animals. So that's kind of like very big picture. Among the things that I'm interested in that sort of are distinct from that, I'm interested in questions about whether there are ethical facts. I'm interested in questions about if we can have ethical knowledge, and if so, how that works. How to think about the kinds of concepts that we use to think about ethical questions.
So some of that then is just to say that the latter bit there was kind of just meta ethics. You're interested in meta ethical questions.
Yeah, so definitely probably the topic that I've worked on most in terms of the kind of classifications that philosophers like to use have been sort of topics in metaethics. I'm also interested in applying normative and evaluative standards to our own ethical representations. So that's a sort of a framework that I call the conceptual ethics of ethics. And those kinds of questions I think, and I've argued, are interestingly distinct from traditional metaethical questions, but often are interesting to sort of think about alongside the traditional ethical questions, traditional
Okay.
metaethical.
Yeah. Great. So, yeah, you're right though that our topic today is sort of specifically on one area, which is going to be yeah, the welfare of non-human animals. So, when we start to think about that, I guess a natural sort of thing that a lot of people are worried about is going to be, factory farming. So I guess there's going to be an initial question, right? When we start thinking about factory farming, why do we care about factory farming? What's special about factory farming that's sort of getting us all riled up? If we're sympathetic to the welfare of animals, what is it about factory farming that sort of gets us all worked up?
Well, I mean, I think different people get worked up in different ways, but one way of thinking about it is that if you take as a premise that um, non-human animals can have well-being, their lives can go better or worse, and that how well their lives are going matters ethically, then the sort of classic way to be concerned about factory farming is that what you have is, extraordinary amounts of suffering kind of at industrial scale, right? So there are lots of cases where there's suffering of non-human animals that we might be concerned about, but here it seems like we have like massive, large-scale industries involving tens and hundreds of millions of non-human animals being treated in ways that look like these forms of treatment are being executed in ways to maximize profit in the use of the non-human animals in ways that predictably lead to enormous amounts of suffering. And so people who are sort of more zealous about this will sort of draw analogies between the amount of suffering that goes on in these cases and, for example, the Holocaust. And so, like, the thought is one thing that is a parallel between these is that it's not just a kind of accidental phenomenon, it's a sort of massive systematic system that is sort of having as a predictable, straightforward effect the large scale suffering of millions and millions of creatures.
All right. So maybe, there's going to be an initial thought that, well, that's true, but also, people get such a tremendous amount of pleasure out of eating meat or something that actually, on balance, it turns out that maybe this is, maybe it's fine. What would you want to say about that?
So, um, I want to be, I want to sort of walk I want to sort of back into that question a little bit, right? So, the first thing to think about when we're thinking about food, one thing to think about when we're thinking about food is sort of immediate gustatory pleasure. But like food does lots of other things for us, right? Food is central to our biological maintenance. Food has all kinds of interesting cultural significances. Right? Food is meaningful for people in all kinds of very complicated ways. So as first thing, I think like you don't want to just kind of reductively think about this in terms of pleasure necessarily. You want to think like, look, food is something which is caught up in all kinds of very complicated ways in people's lives. Um, so to be sort of fair to the person who thinks, hey, isn't it, so suppose we grant that there is a tremendous cost that goes with factory farming, but you might think, oh, there's a sort of tremendous benefit that goes with it. So somebody might say, look, you can't raise a chicken in a non-factory farming setting in a way that is nearly as economically efficient. And what that means is that if you think of all the gustatory pleasure that people get from eating fried chicken or eggs, etc., many people, those pleasures would not be available to them if factory farming was, as it were, not on the menu, because it would simply be infeasibly more expensive to eat these animal products, for example, if they were being farmed in more humane ways, right? So if you want to think about that side of things, I think probably the sort of strongest way of developing that argument is to sort of start out thinking, look, we as a sort of collective as humans, we have some choice points. And one way to think about the choice point is, do we want to have inexpensive animal products that are made with tremendous amounts of suffering, or do we want to have more expensive animal products that are made with less suffering, or do we want to have no animal products at all? Like those are sort of three options to kind of think about. So, so that's the first part of how I would want us to think about that situation. And so far, I haven't really been talking about the individual at all. I've really been thinking about this sort of as a system and how we should evaluate the system. Because you might think that I take it the sort of thrust of the kind of concern that you were raising was maybe as a system, although, there's lots of suffering that it produces, maybe as a system, the system is sort of overall okay, right? Um, so having set things up that way, I want to say several things to explain why I'm not at all persuaded by this picture. So one is you want to distinguish between goods that are substitutable and goods that are plausibly not substitutable, right? So if you had a choice between eating some fried chicken and starving, obviously the sort of level of welfare you're going to have if you eat the fried chicken is going to be much higher than the level of welfare that you have if you're starving, right? But that's not actually the choice situation that we face. Um, the vast majority of people have a wide variety, and certainly in North America, most of us have an almost embarrassingly historically aberrant variety of food choices available to us. And so it's not as if the choice is between, having a pleasant experience eating fried chicken and starving. It's the choice is between eating fried chicken and eating something else, right? So I've been a vegan now for many years, probably more than 20 years now, if I think about it. And I don't think that I experience less pleasure from eating food than people who enjoy eating animal products do. I am somebody I'm very into food. I enjoy eating food. I enjoy making food. I enjoy like thinking about how to make food delicious. And it doesn't seem to me that I have sort of taken a hit to my welfare in virtue of not eating animal products. The most sort of a hit to my welfare is that sometimes things are a little less convenient, right? There are certain kinds of contexts. If I'm in an airport, I have fewer desirable food choices usually as a vegan than somebody who can eat all the different kinds of foods. On the other hand, sometimes those facts about limited choices are actually, in a funny way, advantageous. So one of the facts about our world that's really important is that most of the food that's most readily available to us is extremely unhealthy. And so having an ethical principle, which tells me that I'm not going to eat that food, also helps me to eat less unhealthy food, which is good for me, right? So the question of like what we're giving up when we're giving up animal products is a really delicate question. We are definitely giving up specific things. But it's not like we're giving up gustatory pleasure. We're giving up specific gustatory pleasure. Nothing tastes exactly like, a steak. Nothing tastes exactly like certain kinds of fried chicken, although fried chicken to vegan products are getting closer, I think. So the question that you have to ask when you're sort of weighing these things is there something really special about the value of these particular goods that we can't substitute for where there's a loss? And I think in some cases there is a loss. Like I think there are these kinds of food traditions that are very central and important to many people and their cultures. And so, like, if you're going to have Thanksgiving dinner with your family, like the thought that, like, oh, there's going to be no turkey involved in your Thanksgiving dinner, like that might be something that for many people that they experience not just as like the taste profile of dinner is different, but the sort of the kind of tradition that they're used to being a part of, they've been deprived of. And so I do think there are some losses there. I just think that it's important not to think of the losses as like have tasty food, no have tasty food. That's a sort of misleading way of framing the problem. And so then once you sort of identify, look, there are some genuine costs, then it seems to me that you have to sort of stack those genuine costs against like what are the costs on the other side? Like are the kinds of things that we genuinely would lose, that would genuinely make our lives poorer in virtue of being vegan, if indeed there are such things on balance. I think there are particular such things, but whether on balance someone's life tends to be better or worse as a vegan, I think probably on balance it tends to be better. So it's actually quite tricky. Um, but on the other side, you have to notice like we're talking about like again millions and millions and millions of non-human animals suffering and dying at our hands. And my thought is that it doesn't take a lot of moral imagination to think that the ethical significance of the suffering and death of these non-human animals is greater than the ethical significance of the sacrifice, so-called, that I make in like, refraining from eating fried chicken or a steak. And so that's kind of the starting point for me for thinking about these ethical questions is that it's important not to ignore or trivialize the kinds of reasons people have for eating animal products. And for some people, in some situations, those reasons may be extremely powerful. But I think for the vast majority of people in the vast majority of situations, as a matter of fact, they would likely be better off if they ate many fewer animal products. And they would also be not interacting in a way that is connecting to this food system, which strikes me as engaging in a systematic, horrifying, large scale ethical wrong.
So yeah, maybe that's just a quick little question about that then. So suppose you have somebody with I don't know, some sort of like dietary restrictions such that you know, being even like a vegetarian just kind of isn't really on the table. Is that, a kind of case where we do have to then be like a lot more careful about the sort of things that we want to say?
So I want to be very careful about like which topics I claim to have expertise about. I don't think there are many people for whom facts about their individual biology make it the case that they can't be, for example, a healthy vegan or a healthy vegetarian. But I do think there are, for example, certain world situations, so actually existing situations in the world, which I take very seriously, where it seems to me that suggesting that people in these situations have reasons to live without animal products, it seems to me there are very strong countervailing considerations in those cases. So, for example, if you think about people in traditional Inuit cultures, like the entire sort of food system in those traditional cultures is really built around animal products in a way that like if you were to say no you're not going to eat any of those things anymore it would basically potentially be like quite culturally corrosive. um, that's one kind of case. Another kind of case, like, look, like a story from my own life, I grew up on a tiny little self-sufficient farm. And when I was very little, like we brought home a cow and we had a cow and we had like milk all the time, and like My mom would say like the day we got the cow, we went from being poor farmers to being rich farmers. And like one thing to say about that is like suddenly we had this like reliable source of protein that was in our diet all the time, which that might seem for somebody who can just like, right now in my life, I can just go down the street to the grocery store and buy any number of products. Not really an issue for me. But if, for example, you're a family doing subsistence farming in many parts of the world, having an animal is going to mean that you have a much healthier diet profile than a family who doesn't have animals, right? And so some contexts where we're thinking about certain kinds of subsistence farming of people who are just in general very economically disadvantaged in the world, and some people where they're parts of cultures where the entire ecosystem and food culture sort of mitigates in favor of eating non-human animals. I think there's really interesting countervailing considerations for people like that. And I think I'm not like confident about what to say about those cases. What I am confident in is that those cases are much harder cases at very least. And maybe in those cases, people can be using animal products in ways that try to minimize the suffering to the non-human animals while still meeting their needs. But I do think like those cases are the exceptional cases, and for the vast majority of the people in the vast majority of parts of the world, that's not the situation they confront, and that actually they would again be leading better lives on balance if they learned largely to live without animal protein, for example.
Okay, perfect. So let's just take as our sort of background knowledge then the sort of basic case where most of us are sort of in a position to just substitute all of our sort of animal products for something else that's basically just as good. So then there's going to be this question about causal impotence. So the thought here is just going to be that like if you and I and a few thousand other vegans or whatever we all refrain from eating meat, but the general population sort of doesn't. What sort of impact are we having? Plausibly maybe next to zero. What should our sort of relationship be if if we're not really having a big impact? I mean, how should we sort of think about that sort of thing?
Good. So I think this is the hardest part of thinking about these ethical questions. And I just want to, again, kind of back into this question, but because I want to explain why I think this question is especially hard. So there are some cases where many of us at least think that we have reasons to perform actions, and our reasons to perform actions aren't explained in terms of good or bad outcomes of those actions. So, for example, it seems to me that like I have reasons to be respectful of you, not because like, oh, you're gonna feel good about yourself. Like that's also like if I'm disrespectful of you, you feel shitty about yourself. That's like a bad effect of the thing I've done. But you might also think, I owe you basic kind of respect just as another human being, not because it's going to have good effects on you, but rather because like that is part of the sort of orientation that an ethically decent person has to another person. And so that's a case where we have reasons to behave in certain ways, where at least many people think those reasons are not to be explained in terms of good and bad outcomes. One excellent example of this that's a sort of very prominent idea many people take seriously is the idea of anti-paternalism, right? So the idea is that if you are an adult human being, if I figure out your life would be slightly better if, you moved to Columbus. Suppose for some reason I knew that to be true. Um, Still, the thought is if I like went to your house and like at gunpoint got you into the moving van and moved you to Columbus, like not okay, right? Even if I'm doing it because like, oh man, this is what's going to be best for Luke. Um, Still not okay to like make these decisions for you, right? And so there are these cases where we have reasons, sometimes extremely powerful reasons, which look like they're not based in the goodness or badness of outcomes. Now, this is controversial. Some people will say, ultimately, I have a fancy theory where ultimately it's all based in the goodness and badness of outcomes. But sort of at an intuitive level, it looks like there's these kind of contrast. Now, one of the things that I think is hard about the case of factory farming is that it looks to me like the ultimate explanation of our reasons really does have to do with the goodness and badness of outcomes. It's the badness of the animal suffering that we are concerned with. It's not like we're concerned about like, you know, respecting the animal's autonomy or something. Some people are concerned about that, but it's unclear whether animals have the kind of autonomy that it would make sense to respect. And so if you're really concerned about the goodness or badness of these outcomes, then here's a very natural thought. The way to be oriented to things where you're concerned about the goodness or badness of outcomes is to try to like make there be more of the good outcomes and fewer of the bad outcomes, right? Philosophers will sometimes talk about promoting value, which is a slightly more technical way of getting at that same idea, right? And then if somebody comes along and says, look, the way our like food system and economic system is set up, if you go down the street to, Joe's Burger Barn and you buy a cheeseburger, like that will have like that will not promote any particular outcome in terms of how many cows suffer, right? Just the food system is not sensitive enough to people's buying behavior for that to happen. And then you might think, now we have a real problem. It seems like there's this food system, it's doing these bad things, but it looks like, oh, I thought initially that I had reasons, for example, not to eat meat because of the bad things the food system was doing. But if I can't make any difference to what the food system does through my choices of, having the cheeseburger or eating something vegan, then you might think, oh, I don't actually have reasons to do those things after all. So that I take it is kind of the sort of core of the kind of deep puzzle in this space. And I can say several things here. One question is like, how theoretically sophisticated you want to get. So I'm going to start at the very theoretically unsophisticated level and kind of work my way up. And at the very theoretically unsophisticated level, you might say, we have this belief, which comes up again and again in public discourse, that like when there are bad things going on, you should behave in ways that are kind of against those bad things, right? That's a sort of very prominent kind of intuitive thought many people have. Now, maybe that thought is misguided, right? Maybe that thought doesn't make any sense. But if you're sort of content with just sort of keeping things at a kind of very coarse-grained, simple level, I think that's sort of one way to think about things. And then you can think, well, maybe we can develop more sophisticated models which try to capture that initial thought or some version of that initial thought and try to sort of put some theoretical meat onto those bones, as it were, right? And there's several different kinds of strategies here. So I'll just sort of mention a few of them. Some people think the key is to think about how individuals relate to groups. And so the thought is, maybe I, as an individual vegan, can't make any difference, but in aggregate, surely all the vegans in North America, they make a difference. All right. So they make a difference, and then my relationship to them, that's sort of the key idea, right? So that's a kind of group mediated picture. We could talk about that. Another kind of picture, which in the past I was quite sympathetic to, appeal to the idea of complicity. So the idea here is that if somebody's doing something bad, you can do something that's wrong or bad by being related to what they're doing, even if you're not making it the case that what they're doing is going to happen more, right? So let me give you a kind of example, right? Suppose somebody's going to rob a bank, right? And they need somebody to drive the getaway car. And if you don't agree to drive the getaway car, Al's going to drive the getaway car and he's going to do just as good a job driving the getaway car as you are, right? And so it's not as if like fewer banks are going to be robbed if you're like, no, I won't drive the getaway car. And of course, if you drive the getaway car, you didn't rob the bank, right? That's not like that's not what you're doing. You're just driving the getaway car. But intuitively, what you're doing in driving the getaway car, assuming that robbing the bank is wrong, right? Have to set aside sort of Robin Hood type views here, right? But if you assume that robbing the bank is wrong, then plausibly like driving the getaway car is wrong. Why is that? Well, you're an accomplice, right? You are not robbing the bank, but you're an accomplice. You're playing a kind of role that the bank robbers need someone to play in order for them to successfully rob the bank, right? And so you might think the same thing about consumers who are buying uh, ethically, objectionably produced goods. You might think the people who are producing those goods, they aren't producing those goods for fun, right? They're not like, you know, what I would like to do is I'd like to create like a massive concentrated animal feeding operation and just run it and see what happens, right? No, they're doing it because they intend to, at the end of the day, sell animal products and make a good living or maybe not a good living out of doing that, right? So and then the thought is, well, they need somebody to be playing a certain role, not the, running the factory farm role. That's their role. But they need somebody to be playing the buying the food role, right? And so you might think that just in the same way that the person driving the getaway car isn't robbing the bank, but they're an accomplice in robbing the bank. So the person who's buying the animal products isn't factory farming, but they're an accomplice in the factory farming. Right. So that's a second kind of model that you might be interested in. Um, there's a third sort of more abstract kind of model, which is the thing which I've become more sympathetic to recently. And the heart of that model goes something like this. And I'm not going to do it full justice because it's a little bit complicated, but the idea is that when we look at bad effects, many bad effects are best explained by certain kinds of patterns of behavior, not particular behaviors, but sort of large scale patterns of behavior, right? So, for example, right, in North America, we largely drive on the right-hand side of the road, not the left-hand side of the road. And if you're driving like down a country road where there's like no police around or anything, but you want to drive safely, you drive on the right-hand side of the road. And part of why you drive on the right-hand side of the road is you kind of know this is what other people are doing, right? There's a kind of pattern there. And the fact that there's the pattern there kind of structures what it makes sense for other people to do, right? And in general, this is a really good social pattern, right? You want there to be, I mean, it's fine for everybody to drive on the left-hand side of the road. It's also fine for everybody to drive on the right-hand side of the road, but you better pick one, right? You better have there being a social pattern, right? And I think that there's a general principle, which is that when you have like morally good social patterns, the social patterns are like partially constituted by particular individuals' behaviors. And in general, as individuals, we have reasons to do those sorts of things which constitute this kind of replication of that pattern. They partially constitute that, right? So if what's going on around here is people driving on the right, you have reasons to continue driving on the right, not just selfish reasons like, oh, I'm going to prevent myself from getting killed, but also like you should be wanting to make it the case that this pattern persists as a stable pattern, right? And on the other hand, there are also stable patterns that are ethically objectionable. Some of those stable patterns are, say, stable patterns of racism or stable patterns of gender discrimination. But whenever you see a sort of stable social pattern where you see, look, it's not like one person is like flipping a switch and saying there's going to be racism. Rather, it's like, millions of people are making millions of decisions which sort of coordinate in a predictable way to create a kind of racist society, right? Um, it seems to me that when you have a social pattern like that, when we want to explain bad outcomes for people that divide along racial lines, very often we want to explain those things by those large scale patterns. And there it seems to me that the the thing that we should say is the thing that's the opposite of what we wanted to say about the driving on the right-hand side of the road case. Namely, if the social pattern is a nefarious social pattern, we have reasons to not be doing the things that partially constitute that pattern existing. Um, and I think that the case of consumers and factory farming is very similar. I think the patterns of behavior of people eating animal products are exactly the kinds of patterns of behavior that tend to make it the case that this overall pattern, which involves the factory farming and the economic system that factory farming is located in, and which sort of renders the factory farming economically rational, that whole system is objectionable. And so we should be refraining from playing our part in that system in the same way that we should be refraining from playing a constitutive role in a racist social structure or a constitutive role in a social pattern of gender discrimination or what have you. So that's the overall kind of picture that I prefer. And the kind of picture goes from the thought that the overall explanation is happening at a kind of social pattern level, and that each of us, part of our kind of job as agents is to pay attention to the relationship between our behavior and these large-scale social patterns. Because I think these large-scale social patterns explain so much of what we think is ethically important in the world now. We are not living in like tiny communities where what matters is like how Bob treats you. Like what matters is like how millions of people take it for granted that you are to be treated, right? And because of that, I think that we have these significant reasons to play our part in building and maintaining uh, ethically good social structures and trying to resist and undermine ethically problematic social structures. And I think of factory farming as one of the latter kinds of cases.
Okay, perfect. So maybe let's to my ear that sounds similar at least to the kind of don't be complicit account. Is the idea about the social structures just that well, it's going to be exactly that, right? It's kind of how you're relating to social structures. Whereas, with the complicity account, it might be like an individual action, right? Like the bank robbers, like there's not like a social pattern of bank robbings, maybe, but I guess when we're trying to draw like a distinction between these two accounts, what's like a kind of useful way to sort of tease them apart?
So I think you put your finger on, I think, what's crucial. So one of the things that can happen, so the core idea in the complicity model is that there is a person who is a primary actor. Um, and then there's this, the getaway driver, or maybe there's a couple of people who are the bank robbers, what have you, right? But then there's this other sort of status of being this kind of secondary actor. And so that's a particular kind of structure. And then there's a particular kind of ethical principle that sort of says that like the wrongness of the primary action somehow like then sticks to the accomplice. And that there's kind of interesting ethical principle there, right? Now, I think that you could have somebody who has a nefarious plan that doesn't, there's no like social structure at all. Like if I just like get together with my buddy and like we have a nefarious plan, right? That nefarious plan could be like extremely weird and like inconsistent with most of what's going on socially speaking, right? And so it's not as if we'd be like instituting a unjust social structure. We'd just be like doing our nefarious plan. Like if I was like, I'm gonna go rob the bank down the street. Like there's no, I think, nefarious social structure that I'm like partially like creating or something in that. I just have like a kind of isolated individual level sort of wrongful plan, right? Whereas I take it in the social structure sort of picture, like part of the idea is that we want to notice when goods or bads are being produced by these large scale patterns. So that's part of the difference. And then the other part of the difference is that it's not really clear. And I think this is most clear in the cases of things like racism or gender discrimination or what have you. Um, it's not really clear that the way to think about these cases is that there are like primary wrongful actors and there are secondary wrongful actors. It's not really clear that like a helpful way to model racism is like here are like the real racists who are doing the real racist things, and then there's these other people who are like you might sort of like, oh, they're like the bystanders who aren't like intervening, right? And that's like a model, but a model of racial injustice that I find much more persuasive is a model in which, no, like the right way of thinking about what's going on is like partly we don't even think about particular individuals at all. We just think like, what are patterns of behavior that everybody is going to sort of treat as part of the normal background? What are patterns of behavior that are going to stick out as kind of going against the grain, right? Those people, it's not any particular person's attitudes that's doing that. It's not like there's like the cabal who's like, haha, we're going to make this thing happen. And then other people are kind of in the secondary role. So part of the difference I see is that you can have these social structures where it's not clear that you have this difference, whether you have like primary actors and secondary actors. Rather, you can have these sort of scale effects that happen as a kind of complicated result of like all kinds of different people's behaviors and dispositions. Um, and so part of what I like about this is it seems to me that many of the cases that we are concerned about, potentially we can try to say these people are the primary actors. These people are the primary wrongdoers. But I think it's actually often in these cases quite tricky, right? So let me just give you an example from the context of factory farming, right? You might think it's the guy who runs the concentrated animal feeding operation. It's that guy, right? Well, is it the guy who owns the concentrated animal feeding operation? Or is it like the people who are like the workers, many of whom are, working with like very poor labor conditions and have very few other life choices, but those are the people who you might think the particular instances of a person being cruel to a non-human animal, like those are the people who are executing those things, right? So we're like, are those the primary wrongdoers, right? Or you might think there's a small collection of really large food system conglomerates, which for the most part don't actually own these concentrated animal feeding operations, but the people who own the animal feeding operations are basically almost in like a feudal relationship to these large companies. Like they are completely dependent on these large companies. The large companies tell them like how many animals to raise, the conditions. They control whether the operations go out of business or stay in business, et cetera. And so you might think, oh, like maybe they're the primary actors. And I think like my sense, and again, I'm not an expert in these food systems. This is very much an amateur picture of these food systems that I'm sketching. But my sense is that ethically speaking, to be sort of chasing around and being like, what we need to find is like who is the guy who's the primary wrongdoer here? This is sort of misguided. There's this structure, and because of the structure, we can predict that even if this person who's running this concentrated animal feeding operation is like, that's it, ethically speaking, I can't do this anymore, we can predict somebody else is going to rise up and take their place because there's some money to be made filling that role, right? And we can kind of predict that as long as there's a group of consumers that are the group of consumers there are, and as long as our food system is otherwise organized the way that it is, that like whenever somebody quits, like somebody else will like slot in, right? In this way. And if you have that kind of system level analysis, then it seems to me that it's actually not fruitful to be thinking, oh, what we need to do is we define like this primary wrongdoer and then like tell a story about people who are doing something wrong in a secondary way. Rather, it's just that there's this large scale bad, and there's a bunch of people who are related to the large scale bad in various interesting ways. And we can typically say, here's how you're related, and here's why that particular way of being related is objectionable, right? Because people being related in that way play this role in reproducing what's objectionable in the system. So that's a very long-winded answer. I apologize, but that's the kind of that's my attempt to sort of say these are both interesting structures. They have some similarities, but I think there's some important differences in the structures. And I actually think that what I've become convinced by is that the complicity structure, I think, is very apt for some cases. I think it's a very good structure to think about why you object to the person driving the getaway car. I just don't think it's the best kind of structure for understanding the reasons people have in these sort of large scale wrong cases.
Okay, perfect. So Maybe we can sort of tease apart to how that's going to interact with like a basic kind of threshold response. So, I mean, the kind of threshold thought is just that like if enough of us sort of join together and stop buying meat, that's going to have like an impact on the market, right? The amount of sort of animals that get factory farmed is going to go down, and we just kind of keep trying to raise the number of people that sort of join the cause, if you like. And that seems like a basically sort of like consequence focused argument. How does thinking about like this kind of systems analysis sort of interact with that kind of thinking? I mean, are we still kind of thinking like the reason we should like the way to resist these systems is still with a kind of threshold thinking, or is it more of like a just like a sort of in principle kind of thing, like still even if we don't meet some sort of threshold, um, how does it kind of interact with like the kind of threshold thought?
Awesome. So let me say a couple of things. First of all, I want to just, for your listeners and viewers, sort of more carefully introduce what I take to be the best version of the kind of threshold thought, which I learned from an excellent paper from 1980 by Peter Singer called Utilitarianism and Vegetarianism. And the basic thought is this, and it's a thought about um, how it makes sense for us to behave under conditions of certain important kinds of ignorance. So the thought is this: there's some number of people such that if that number of people were to cease eating animal products, um, the system would notice and production would decline by a certain amount, right? So just for concreteness, I'm going to make up some numbers. And it's like perfectly compatible with Singer's argument that we don't know what these numbers are. This is actually part of the point of Singer's argument. But just for concreteness, like imagine that for every like 10,000 people who become vegan, when you hit that 10,000 person tipping point, then like one concentrated animal feeding operation goes out of business and like, 50,000 chickens a year aren't like tortured and killed in nasty ways. Okay. So imagine that's like your picture. Um, what does Singer then want to say to the individual person? Well, what they want to say is like, look, we don't know where we are. We don't know whether we're in the situation in which, imagine like you had a situation in which like we're where I'm like the first of the 10,000 people who would need to happen, or the second, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, etc. It's like we don't know where in that situation I am. And my choosing to be vegan is only going to make a difference if like given the setup of the situation, if like 9,999 other people have chosen to be vegan, and I'm like the 10,000th person, I'm like the tipping point person. Like that's the situation in which I will make a difference. That situation and only that situation, right? Um, and like, look, my chances of that being the situation, I don't know exactly what those are because I don't actually know how many other people, like, I don't know exactly where the tipping point is, and I don't know exactly how many people there are. So, like, I could just like multiply through and say, like, given my ignorance, I should think that my chances of being that person are like 1 in 10,000, right? I could be the first person, I could be the 50th, or I could be this sort of sweet spot 10,000th person, right? That's extremely low probability. And you might like at that point throw up your hands and be like, I've got better things to do than perform an action with like a 1 in 10,000 chance of making a moral difference. But Singer's like, well, hold on. If you are that 10,000th person, the difference you're going to make is huge. It's not like you're going to save the life of like a chicken or three chickens. You're going to like save like 50,000 chickens a year from being like tortured and killed. That's massive. And then what he says is we can multiply through. We can think your chances of having that impact are 1 in 10,000. But if you have that impact, you're going to have this massive impact. Say you're going to save 50,000 chickens. So maybe like the impact of your becoming vegan is going to be that you're going to save 5 chickens a year from these awful lives of suffering and early death. And so that's not what's actually likely to happen. What's likely to happen is that you have no effect whatsoever. But in a technical sense, because you have this tiny chance of making this really big impact, when you multiply through, the sort of expected effect is almost as if you could be sure that you were going to save 5 chickens a year, right? So that's kind of the Singer argument. And this argument is controversial. Some people think, no, we can't make any difference. Some people think, yes, like the basic Singer argument is basically sound, right? Um, my own view about this is a little bit nuanced. I think the question of whether Singer's argument is sound is at the end of the day, in part, a question about like how our food systems actually work. Like, what are the levels of sensitivity? How stable are the populations? What's the information we can have about those things? And so I think like it could well be, and my considered view is that the world probably actually is roughly the way that Singer describes it as being. But I also think, suppose that I find out the world isn't that way. Suppose that Singer is wrong, and like, as a matter of fact, the expected impact of my being a vegan is zero, right? Going to have no positive impact whatsoever. My thought is that that doesn't like end the story about how I should behave. I think I have this other principle, which I think is a sound principle, which tells us how to behave independently of these claims about expected effects. But I think, as a matter of fact, we are probably in a situation in which both kinds of considerations apply, in which we do have straightforward expected effects reasons, although, like, we are in saying that, I'm not convinced that's true because how our food system works in relevant ways is actually quite complicated. But I think that like probably that's how things go. And if you have the Singer mindset, you can just multiply through there as well. You can say, suppose that it's 50% likely that the food system works the way that Singer suggests it works in that sort of general structure. Well, then, if it's 50% likely, then given my belief in that, then my expected outcome of being a vegan, given the little numbers I gave you before, is like saving 2.5 chickens a year instead of five. Like, okay, that's still making similar, it's a similar kind of difference. I'm just multiplying through by my sense of the chances that that works. The reason why I haven't spent a lot of time in my own thinking on this kind of structure is that it has always seemed to me that even if I am convinced with certainty that I'm not making any difference, I think I still have some important reasons. And so a lot of my work has been about thinking about how to understand those reasons and thinking about the puzzle that I sort of started us off with at the beginning of this conversation, where it seems like the reasons have to be connected in the right way to these outcomes. But like, what if we're not making any difference to the outcomes? How does that work? Right. And I've been very interested in that puzzle, but I'm interested in that puzzle against the background of thinking like, yeah, actually, probably we do have some reasons that are roughly of the kind that Singer tells us about.
Okay, so yeah, okay, that's interesting. There's something as well that I'm sure you're familiar. There's a different sort of area of ethics. I guess that usually pops up in population ethics. I think the non-identity problem, right?
Mhm.
I've been sort of wondering if some of the things that like some of the issues there sort of rise up here too, like and I'm just gonna give like a really rough and dirty sort of picture. You can sort of refine it as you like. But I mean, if we're thinking that I don't know, suppose you had like a large scale sort of factory farming operation that gave animals like lives that were sort of barely worth living.
Yeah.
Um, is that sort of acceptable at that point, or because it's going to seem like no, probably not, but it's really hard to figure out what's going wrong in a situation like that.
Yeah. So, if you like, we can kind of dig into the non-identity problem more precisely, but that is like technical and unintuitive for a lot of people. So I'm just gonna set that aside for the moment. And I'm gonna sort of talk in other terms. Um, so my thought is that there's a kind of general principle that I think is quite plausible, which is that um, other things being equal. You don't get to justify cruel and inhumane treatment of a person or an animal by saying, well, their life on balance is better than not existing. And if I had not started this pattern of behavior, they wouldn't have existed. Right. So let me just give you the kind of example that I have in mind. Imagine that you have a friend who is a dog breeder, and they have some control over when they breed their female dogs. Um, and you say, and they're like, I have a choice whether to breed this season or not, right? And suppose that you say, okay, look, if you breed this dog this season, um, nobody else is going to be interested. They know the market, right? Whatever kind of dog they're breeding, no one else is going to be interested. But you say, if you breed the dog this dog this season, I will take whichever puppies are in the litter, and I will mistreat them grievously, but I will give them lives that are on balance worth living, right? But like I've always just wanted to like taser puppies. And like, I'm gonna think about like dog well-being, and I'm gonna make sure that like I taser them only at like a frequency that like the other things that are good things in their life, like they're gonna be able to hang out with the other puppies, and they're gonna be fed and stuff. It's gonna balance out so their lives are like just barely worth living. Um, it seems to me that I haven't like thereby morally justified the pattern of behavior that I'm proposing. The fact that the puppies will have a life that is barely worth living, and suppose I have like no interest in having puppies if I'm not going to taser them. That's not the way I roll, right? Um, it seems to me like the fact like, oh well, like look, if I wasn't around tasering these puppies, then the puppies wouldn't exist. And so like the puppies should want me to be around tasering them. I think that all might be true, but it's still intuitively just egregiously objectionable for me to be tasering the puppies, right? And I think that what that tells us is that there are some ways of treating other human beings and non-human animals as well, where we don't think the way to evaluate this is like, what is the overall impact on the well-being of this individual? Rather, we can sort of evaluate particular patterns of behavior, and we can say, no, you know what? Like, if your plan is to have these puppies around just for the purposes of causing them to suffer, like that's not an okay plan, even if the puppies are going to be overall have lives that are on balance worth living. And I think that to me seems like a very plausible kind of principle. And I think that kind of principle is going to apply out to these kinds of cases. It's not the case that I think we in general have strong reasons to like bring individuals into existence if they're going to have lives that are worth living. Um, and I think that we do have strong reasons not to bring into existence in order to sort of wrongfully mistreat them for our own ends.
Um, okay, so there's obviously there's a lot that's can be said about this, but I guess one thought is when we're looking for a sort of explanation of like what makes that wrong, like the puppy taser thing, right? Um, Obviously, it's not going to be like some sort of like consequential appeal because they have lives that are, I guess, like barely worth living, right? And that's like better consequentially than them not existing. So, I guess when we're looking for an explanation of the wrongness, I mean, how are we gonna like cash that out? Is that in terms of like people's intentions, or what's sort of doing the work and explaining like what makes that wrong?
That's a really good question. So one of the things I should say about normative ethics in general, about sort of thinking about substantive ethical questions, is that I often think that we are in situations where we're very clear that some pattern of behavior is wrong, and it's much more controversial what the right kind of explanation for that is. And the way that you see why that's controversial is you start looking at certain kinds of edge cases, which pull various features apart. And then it turns out people's judgments are less clear about those cases and they argue about them. Now, I think there are some cases where part of what's going on is that there are lots of different things, each of which are very strong reasons. So I think like if you ask the question like why is it wrong to kill another human being? I think that's a pretty bad question because I think there's like lots of different sufficient reasons why it's wrong to kill another human being, right? Like for most human beings, you have like deprived them of the valuable life they might have had in the future, and that's like one kind of forward-looking consequentialist kind of reason. But I think also like most people don't want to be killed, and just in the same way that it would be like objectionable interference with your agency to like kidnap you and move you to Columbus, it would be an even more dramatic way of interfering with your agency if I were to kill you, right? And I think that that's independent of the fact that I would be depriving you of these valuable things in the future. I'm like interfering with your agency in a very profound way. Some people think that like there's like attitudes of respect for agency that like if I were killing you, I'd be like somehow my behavior would be exemplifying or flowing from an objectionable attitude. So I think part of what's hard in these cases is I think that there are going to be lots of different kinds of considerations that we can potentially appeal to. So let me just sort of mention several kinds of considerations, right? It's very natural in the kind of case that I sketched to say that there's something objectionable about the character, my character, as I describe myself in this situation. Like there's something like it seems like a person who just wants to taser puppies, they are vicious. And like somehow like the plan that I have to taser the puppies, you might think, oh, it's objectionable as a plan because it like flows from my vicious character, right? You might think, no, it's not about the character so much, it's about my particular intentions. Um, but you also might think, like, look, there's certain kinds of actions, right? Um, think about the don't focus on intentions, but think about like the actions themselves, right? If you are causing suffering to another individual, in general, that's a kind of action that is a wrongful kind of action. And one thing about which the simplest kind of act utilitarian disagrees with almost everybody else is that almost everybody else thinks um, it's not okay. It doesn't make it okay for me to inflict a bunch of suffering on you if by doing so, I'm going to make some other happiness somewhere else, right? So, for example, if it turns out like a lot of well-being will be created by like my starting like the YouTube channel Luke Jensen gets tortured and then I put up videos of me torturing you and millions of people enjoy seeing you tortured like that doesn't make it okay to do that, right? At least almost everybody who's not the most committed kind of act utilitarian thinks that, right? Okay. So um so now things get quite delicate. So I want to point out the following kind of case. In general, it is actually, there are kinds of things that make it okay to cause suffering to another individual. So, for example, I take it even without their consent. If my dog is sick, it's okay for me to take them to the veterinary hospital for painful surgery. Because the painful surgery is going to cure them of an illness that would otherwise like make their life go much, much worse, right? And you might try to sort of say, oh, like the person who's bringing the puppies into existence in order to taser them, they're in a similar sort of situation, right? The tasering is like a means to like this good outcome of the puppies having a life that's worth living. But it's a really weird means because I don't, in fact, need to taser the puppies. I just want to taser the puppies, right? And so I think the case of tasering the puppies is quite different from the case of like giving the puppies needed medical operations that cause them to suffer, because it's necessary for the puppy's existence in a certain sense, but only because of my psychology. And in general, that is not the kind of feature that looks like it's a sort of justifying condition for producing uh, a lot of suffering. Um, if I'm like, look, the only way this good outcome can happen is if I cause you to suffer a lot. Like that doesn't in general make it okay for me to cause you to suffer. That's the kind of core thought. And again, there's tons more that we could say here, but that's kind of like first pass.
Right. And I think that is perfectly sufficient to give people something to think about. So now there were a handful of questions, one of which actually just came up organically. So I guess there's like three left here, from people that are not me, just people that wanted to ask you stuff in general. So one I mentioned earlier was the honey farming thing. And the question is basically like, what do you think about, I don't know, edge cases, I guess, where we're not really sure how it goes for a bee, right? I mean, what's it like to be a bee? Like, I don't know, right? So it's like, should we kind of err on the side of caution when we're like honey farming? Like, does that harm the bee? Like, I don't know. It seems like we're kind of just left in like fog as to like whether that's like harming them or not. Like, do bees like what's I don't know what it's like to be a bee, right? So I mean, what do we sort of think about like weird cases like that?
So let me just separate out some features of this case that I think are valuable to separate out. So one question that's a really important kind of hard question is um, what are the bounds of those entities um, that can have lives that, in an ethically important sense, can go well or poorly, right? I take it to be uncontroversial that my dog's life can go well or poorly. It can suffer, it can enjoy, right? Um, I take it to be, on the other hand, pretty uncontroversial that in that sense, um, my houseplant's life can't go well or poorly. It can go well or poorly in a different sense, like some houseplants are healthy and thriving, some houseplants are not, but it's not like no houseplant is suffering, no houseplant is like, having valuable experiences, it seems to me, right? And it seems to me those things are quite important for thinking about the ethics of these things. So um so one question is like where that boundary is. And it seems to me that that boundary doesn't line up exactly with the animal kingdom. So, for example, there are lots of mollusks that basically don't have any kind of like meaningful nervous system at all. Um, and so it's very implausible, for example, that like a scallop could possibly suffer, right? I think a scallop is basically like on the side of this tipping point with the houseplant, right? Where like it can in a certain sort of natural sense it can flourish or not flourish, but it's not clear to me that for the sake of the scallop we should be attempting to like make its scallop life go better rather than worse. And on the other hand, it seems to me that like almost any mammal can, its life can go better and worse. And with respect to like, as the way I think about this is that um, there are difficult questions about what we can know. And the basic strategy for what we can know is we can look at patterns of behavior, we can look at underlying neural structures, and we can look at sort of evolutionary history and like how close the evolutionary history of a creature is to the evolutionary history of creatures that we're very confident, for example, can feel pain and suffer. And what I want to say is that like I am in general find it like pretty plausible that bees are on the scallops and houseplants side of that. On the other hand, there are some tricky questions because one of the things that's true of bees is that they like exhibit very complicated, sophisticated patterns of coordinated behavior. And that sort of suggests a kind of a certain sophistication in cognitive architecture. And so there's, a bunch of live debates in the literature about like various kinds of fish and whether they can feel pain or suffer, various kinds of insects. I'm generally like when it comes to bees and insects, etc., I'm generally thinking almost certainly these things do not have lives that are morally valuable. Um, but there's like a tiny chance that they do. Um, so that's in general where I come down. I think that I have respect for a kind of precautionary principle in this context, which says even when it's like quite unlikely that you're going to do some morally significant harm, like try to avoid performing the action that might turn out in the small chance of small that might, from your perspective, have only a small chance of doing so. That seems like a good general kind of principle. I mean, part of what makes it hard is that you've got to trade these things off against each other. So sometimes you're going to have choices where it's like, well, do I do that? Or do I do this other thing, which has like small but like concretely verifiable harms that are associated with it? Um, and I think those cases can be quite difficult. Um, but in general, I think the case brings out this really hard general feature, which is that we are not in a perfect situation with respect to being able to figure out which other creatures um, have the relevant kinds of capacities to make their lives ethically valuable. And then there's also this history of us sort of underestimating non-human animals and what their capacities are, which should, like, I think, sort of increase our use of the precautionary principle that like maybe I'm just systematically misunderstanding how B capacities work. And I certainly am not an expert in that. So I think you put those two things together and like that's like reasons to be cautious. But on the other hand, like sometimes we just have to do the thing that like seems best to us given the information that we have.
So another question was kind of just what you think about like hunting, I guess. And there's going to be like different kinds of hunting too. Like there's kind of like hunting for sport, right? Where I guess you just kind of go out and just shoot stuff because you can. But
Yep.
there's others. There's something that I became aware of compensatory mortality, where sometimes they will have people go out and on purpose try and keep the ecosystem sort of in good health, I suppose, by going out and hunting certain sorts of things. So it's probably not as simple as just, well, what do you think about hunting? Because like there's
Yeah.
different, yeah, but yeah.
So yeah, so let me say, right, so part of part of what's difficult about this kind of question is that very often there's a bunch of different questions in the vicinity. So, for example, um, in North America, arguably we have deer overpopulation in many parts of North America, and we have deer overpopulation in many parts of North America because human beings have largely removed the apex predators, things like wolves, for example, that would keep deer populations in check in situations in which they were around. Um, and if you hold all that fixed, if you think, look, there's really good reasons for this, I don't really want like wolves running around in my local parks in Columbus, right? Um, then you might think maybe we as human beings have a kind of powerful ecological reasons to keep deer populations at levels where the um, harms that the deer do to other parts of the ecosystem are mitigated, right? And so I think there's definitely a class of reasons for hunting and for culls like that. One of the things that's sort of tricky there is I think that like I'm definitely not an expert in like how to think about those ecological questions, and I think there's deep questions about like should that be like something that's a priority for us, or should we be more worried about like the places where we are actively degrading the relevant ecosystems ourselves? Um, but I think that at least in principle, there's a really interesting case to be made for hunting where the hunting is in part driven by, again, a kind of like broadly consequentialist sort of ecological thinking that like given the background about the lack of apex predators, we need to coordinate as humans and step in and play that apex predator role in order to like mitigate the damage that's otherwise being done to these ecosystems. I think that's an interesting form of argument. I think there's an interesting question about like is hunting the way to do that, or should we instead be For example, like preventing deer from reproducing. Like that's a different kind of intervention, which might be less objectionable to some people at least, right? And you get a similar dynamic with, for example, feral cats in North America, right? Where some people, you have shelters that will eventually euthanize animals because they can't care for them, right? You have no-kill shelters where part of like very often part of what's going on is that they have an ethos where we're going to manage the feral cat population by spaying and neutering enough of them that we don't sort of have this continual population growth going on, right? So you could try to apply a similar kind of strategy, and you might think that's a less harmful way of achieving similar kinds of results than the hunting strategy. But I think they're really, really complicated questions about details in all of these cases.
Right. So there's one last question, which was maybe it just sort of collapses into the first question about sport hunting because the question is just supposing that you had I don't know, suppose that you could run like a very humane sort of factory farming operation where like the animals have great lives until you sort of slaughter them, right? Is that something that we should find acceptable, or is there some sort of reason for thinking that no, that's still not okay? And yeah, maybe that's still just like gonna be related maybe to like what we think about sport hunting because like maybe they're fine out in the wild, but then like should we be able to kill them? I don't know. Maybe those questions sort of collapse in on each other. But yeah, that's the last question.
Yeah, yeah, good. So actually, this question is like interesting and it brings up some interesting and different issues, and in a way, it brings up interesting issues that are connected to the previous conversation that we were having. Um, so, because partly the question is if you have a system in which now we're not talking about me like puppies with lives that are barely worth living. Um, but like imagine now, just for sort of clarity, right? We imagine a version of the same case where I talk to the dog breeder and I'm like, look, um, I've always wanted to eat dog, and here's what we're going to do. I'm going to adopt this next litter of puppies. If they don't exist, they don't exist. But if you create them, I will adopt them, and I'll give them like the best puppy lives. Like they will have three. Each of those puppies will have three amazing puppy years. And then at the end of that time, I will kill them as humanely as it's possible to kill an animal without spoiling the taste of the meat, and then I will enjoy eating them. And so part of what's going on in that case, I think there's an issue. The question of what you say about some of the population ethics issues becomes much more significant. Um, so you could say very similar things to the things that I said about the initial kind of case that like, look, it looks like I have this objectionable plan. It looks like there's surely something objectionable about my choosing to kill these animals when I could simply just continue on. There's like something artificial. It's not as if like I'm going to kill them in order to give them the good lives for this period of time. It's like that's not actually how that works, right? Um, but you might think, yeah, but there's like all this extra good puppy life that happens in the situation that wouldn't otherwise happen, right? Um, and one thing that's different about the humane farming case, you might think, from the like, I've always wanted to eat dogs case, is that given my situation, you might think, like, I'm not going to adopt the puppies and then just give them good lives, but I totally could. That's like entirely within the realm of possibility. Whereas you might think that in the humane farming case, like, in order to make it economically possible for the humane farmer to like care for these animals and for them to have reasonably good lives for the amount of time that he's caring for them before they slaughter them, um, like in order for him to be able to afford doing that, he's got to then slaughter them and sell the meat, right? Um, and so you might think that it's like it's not just this like objectionable ad hoc addition that we're going to shorten these animals' lives. It's like crucial to like this being a feasible thing that a altruistically minded person might want to do um, at all. So so that makes the case harder. And I think there, in order to really get into that, you need to um, get more into how to think about these questions in population ethics and like, is it um, is it like a good thing for this animal to exist and have a good life? And does that good thing compensate for the fact that then this prima facie wrong thing we're going to do at the end of its life to shorten its life? And I think because I think like, intentionally having a plan which ends with intentionally killing an animal in order to like then profit by selling its flesh, like that is like prima facie like a wrongful thing to do. And so the real question is like whether you have this compensatory, whether this other good compensates. And I think there's just really deep questions of population ethics that start rising up and sort of how we think about the value of lives that are merely possible. And I don't I don't have clear views about those things. I'm inclined to think that in the case where you're thinking about creating the animals, um, it's still wrong to do that. On the other hand, imagine you had the following kind of company. This is the kind of case which I am sympathetic to. Imagine that you had the following kind of company which rescues animals from bankrupt factory farms that would otherwise just be slaughtered and gives them several years of good life and then humanely slaughters them and sells the meat. There, it seems to me the animals already exist. And this might be like, given the economic pressures on the people trying to perform this activity, this might be like the best they can do for the relevant non-human animals. And so it seems to me like that version of that case, some version of that case might actually be legitimate. So, and so I think like that case is different from the case where we're creating the animals. And the case where we're creating the animals, I think, is much more complicated and difficult because it raises a bunch of these questions of population ethics.
Yeah, that's sort of how it goes. Trying to do philosophy. You try and answer one question, and 10 more pop up. Obviously, though, that does exhaust the list of questions I had. So yeah, I don't know if you have any like final thoughts. I'll just give you the floor to say anything that maybe you'd like to say before we wrap up.
Yeah, I'll maybe say like one very brief thing. So, you know, I'm a vegan. I'm also a professional philosopher. And in this conversation, I've largely tried to have my professional philosopher hat on. And I just want to talk about the relationship between these two things. So, as a professional philosopher, in general, I am trying to find the complexities, ethically speaking, and to try to understand what's interesting about those complexities and how we can think better about those complexities. And so part of what's happened in this conversation is like in many cases I've said, like, oh, like let's be like more careful about thinking about this case. Here's some complexities in this case. And I think that's intellectually valuable. This is like an activity that I think is both enjoyable and I also think helps us to become better ethical thinkers. But I think that it's important. One of the things about the case of eating non-human animals that I think is important is that this is a thing where I actually think the core of the argument is very simple, and I think it's very simple and very powerful. And so I don't want people to come away from this conversation being like, everything's so complicated, who knows what to do? I actually think like, no, like people should be trying to the extent that they're able to move towards eating less meat, learning how to be vegan, becoming vegan. Like I don't think you should just like go cold turkey because I think you should be trying to do this in a way that's sustainable, which involves learning a bunch of skills about how to live a healthy life as a vegan. And I think that's something that for most people is something that they should progress to over a period of time and not do immediately. Um, but I also just want to say, like, there are some really complicated, some of the, I think, hardest questions in ethics arise in this context, and some of them we've talked about briefly in this conversation. But I think that it's important not to treat that complexity in an ideological way and be like, oh, it's also complicated. There must not be any strong reasons for me to be changing my behavior. I think there are really strong reasons for us to be vegans or to be moved towards becoming vegans. Um, but that we can recognize that while also trying to understand the really hard, complex philosophical questions that are lurking underneath the surface.
All right, perfect. Yeah, I really think this was good. I think that everything here was really interesting. I'm mostly hoping that people take it seriously and have something to think critically about. So yeah, I'm really happy you showed up. Obviously, you didn't have to, so that's I think it's really cool when people come do I don't know, sort of public philosophy, I guess. I think it's a service. So I'm happy you were here. I'm glad that you were able to
Well,
show up.
thanks for
Yeah.
making this happen. I really appreciate it. And yeah, best of luck with the podcast more generally. I think more people who can be doing this kind of sort of approachable public facing philosophy, the better.